Give me money, give me money, give me money, give me money, give me money.
Okay, so a weird thing happened today. I sat down writing about anti-heroes, not really knowing where it was going to go, and I ended up using the Sith Resurgence as a vector to talk about the trolley problem. And I thought it was pretty interesting, so this episode is less of a lecture and more of an open discussion. I'm gonna be more indulgent. I mean, I'm using my own work as an example, and you don't need to have read it to get where I'm going with this, but I actually want to hear your own insight on this. So this episode is going to have a follow-up where I go through some of the most interesting responses and deconstruct them. Hopefully this will encourage more interaction. Anyway, let's go. The concept of an anti-hero confuses me. They are notoriously hard to define, mostly because they are completely divorced from reality. The trope typically refers to someone with heroic qualities, but the prefix anti indicates opposition to, and therefore anti-hero should mean opposition to heroism, aka a villain. In fact, this is further compounded with anti-villains, who are characters with heroic goals but villainous methods. And if that sounds like the same thing as an anti-hero, you're not wrong. Is Batman an anti-hero? A lot of people say he is, but he has a no-kill policy and is no more violent than most non-Superman superheroes, so no? I mean, he's a grouchy asshole shut off from society, but that's not a problem, so to speak. In fact, people are split on whether Batman is an anti-hero or not, and this is my problem. Anti-heroes at a conceptual level are so fluid and so open to interpretation that you wonder why the trope even exists. Most characters who fall under the banner of anti-hero are very much chaotic good, doing good without regards to the law or morality. And in my experience, chaotic good characters are the ones people get stuck on the most. They're the ones that can confuse people to an unprecedented degree. Chaotic good characters that are shared by multiple people can often flit around wildly in alignment because, again, people really get stuck with them, but chaotic good is still good. All these attempts to codify and explain an anti-hero end up being so confusing and difficult because it's trying to explain a trope without addressing the massive elephant in the room. See, if you prowl around TV tropes long enough, you'll eventually come across two tropes that are honest versions of the previous two: designated hero and designated villain. The gist of it is that a character is heroic or villainous based on how much the author agrees with them in any meaningful capacity, regardless of how they play out. A video I made a few months ago rewriting a segment of my film-length Steven Universe analysis is pretty much dedicated to this, describing how the main character is heroic only by virtue of the creator said so, and when viewed objectively outside that framework, he is anything but. Anti-heroes work the same way. The reason they're so hard to pin down is because what makes certain qualities heroic or unheroic varies wildly from person to person. People will often claim that it's dependent on the culture of the time, but in modern days, with increasingly disparate political leanings that are often incapable of cooperation, culture cannot be said to be so monolithic. Oftentimes, the defense of "it was a different time" doesn't reflect reality. Gone with the Wind was protested heavily in its time for glorifying slavery after all, but you never hear about that. It's less cultural and more dependent on the creator. For example, many stories carry the idea that there is such a thing as taking liberation and freedom from tyranny too far, and that to kill a tyrant would make you as bad as them, and that story ends up tacitly supporting the structures and power over everything else. It's very similar to people in real life saying that punching Nazis is morally wrong and preventing them from speaking is morally wrong, and you'll only drive more people to support them. But the vast majority of people aren't so politically indifferent that someone throwing a punch is going to influence where they lean. Nobody's going to lead toward an ideology that is in favor of genocide because the good guys got violent. Nobody works that way. Anyone who is still sitting on the fascism versus anti-fascism fence has planted themselves there because that's where they want to be, and nothing will make them budge. Perpetual fence sitters, as we call them. The people who insist they will are Nazis and white passing centrists, aka people who either benefit or at least don't have anything to lose from Nazis getting into power. And sometimes marginalized people will parrot that sentiment as well to their own suicidal detriment. And this is ironic because it was only about 10 years ago that Nazis and similar kinds of fascists were treated as cannon fodder. There's something you can slaughter en masse in a story without any ethical guilt, like droids. Doing that now will get you branded as being political by very angry right-wing assholes because in those last 15 years, North American conservatism has become synonymous with fascism. And so yeah, of course they would complain about being treated like cannon fodder, but, you know, fuck them and the people who simp for them. I know what you're thinking. Lily, I know you didn't just start a conversation about anti-heroes just to complain about the right, and you'd be technically correct. The thing is, this sentiment only benefits tyrants. Teaching people that killing tyrants makes them evil tacitly teaches them that the only way to fight tyranny is through completely ineffective means. Yet a lot of otherwise extremely anti-authoritarian people push this narrative to an absurd degree, which I find very strange. People get tired when I talk about a few certain shows to make points like this, so I'm gonna do something a little different. I'm gonna use my own personal experience with this, which means I'm gonna be talking about fanfiction and OCs a little, but I think you'll find this interesting. Okay, so for the last 2 years, me and Michaela have been working on a self-indulgent rewrite of the Star Wars sequel trilogy that junks most of the pretentious bloodline and legacy bullshit in favor of a story about two traumatized lesbians killing fascists. One of the main central characters is Darth Amorosa, one of the last few Sith Lords in the galaxy who has a very different approach to the Sith philosophy. She's essentially all the nuance of the dark side that Disney stripped away. By all accounts, Amorosa is an extremely heroic character. She opposes tyrants of all stripes, First Order and Republic alike. She chastises characters who remain complacent with unjust systems, openly defies the notion of destiny and encourages others to do the same, and spends half the story teaching Rey about how the machine of space capitalism is oiled with the blood of the people. She's essentially a woke socialist Sith Lord, pretty much the opposite of an objectionable character. And yet, reception to her has been thoroughly mixed. Why? Because she is still Sith to the very core. There's one scene where she looks upon a group of galactic trillionaires relishing in their decadent wealth as they exploit slave children for profit and entertainment, and you remember the Canto Bight scene, I'm sure. So what does she do? Kill them. She just fucking kills them. Basically, that thing Rose said she wanted to do in the film. Now, in a time where eat the rich and setting up guillotines outside of Jeff Bezos' house is practically a pastime, her slaughtering a bunch of parasitic rich assholes drew a great deal of criticism from people who didn't really know what they were objecting to. These people were openly making everything worse, profiting off of war by double dealing under the table and enslaving children. They're pure fucking scum, and yet killing them was something people objected to. And I read a lot of backlash to this, and it often consisted largely of complaints that they were unarmed or simply that the act of killing is always wrong regardless of context, but there was no argument for why they should have been allowed to continue as they are, and the arguments against this part of the story were unfocused at best. Putting aside the fact that my stalkers will always object to what I write regardless of what it is, I found the directionless nature of this backlash to be very interesting. Pop culture has been pushing the theme of violence against the violent being a supreme evil for a long time. Star Wars itself pushes that notion a lot.
What are you doing?
He's a traitor to the Republic. Letting him live is too dangerous.
Letting you kill him is against our Jedi beliefs. I won't allow it.
And so a lot of people have absorbed that belief unquestioningly and hold it as a moral code that defines a good guy as someone who is an anti-violence extremist. And people who are violent are at the very least morally gray. And Amorosa is not framed as either of those things. She is openly violent toward oppressors, and the narrative never once paints her in the wrong for being so. And in fact, people who parrot the above sentiment are often portrayed as naive, foolish, hypocritical, or just plain old wrong. And her influence on other characters is not presented as a bad thing. Because of her influence, when Rey sees a guard on Coruscant abusing a Twi'lek war refugee, she kills the bastard and feels no remorse for it. This also prompted a similar response from one person who said, "What if the cop had a family he can no longer provide for because he's been killed?" And my response to that was to say, he should have thought of that before he started abusing his authority for no reason. He didn't think about his family, why should Rey? The idea of killing someone who has inflicted untold suffering on a daily basis is anathema to a lot of people, and they struggle to explain why that is the case or what should be done instead. I firmly believe it's because they were told to think this. They consumed the avalanche of stories where pacifism is glorified completely unquestioningly, and as such they haven't thought about the ethics and complicated mess of that belief. That question of what if the cop had a family is interesting because I always consider a very different version of that. If she doesn't kill him now, how many more people will he abuse? In the small scale, that Coruscant guard's abuse of authority is not an isolated incident. He sought out that authority specifically to wield it like a cudgel. It's school bully mentality. Abusers like having power over people, and they enjoy wielding that power. And because of her wife's tutelage, Rey is smart enough to know that he has done this before, and if he is not stopped now, he will do it again. And he will likely kill someone. In the large scale, you have the trillionaires Amorosa killed. If she didn't do something, they would continue to inflict untold suffering on so many people, and that suffering will be on her hands. Sure, it might not dismantle space capitalism, but the existence of a long-term goal doesn't undercut short-term gains. You've probably heard of the trolley problem, a philosophical experiment where 4 people are strapped to one track and one person is strapped to another. You have access to a lever which will switch the tracks. If you do, the one person dies. If you don't, 4 people die. It's a beautiful philosophical trap because people get really bogged down in ethics and trying to logic away what the sensible decision is. But the actual question presented by the trolley problem is very simple. If you choose to do nothing, are the deaths of those 4 people your fault? If the hero chooses not to kill the villain because it's wrong, are they responsible for the suffering that villain will continue to bring to others?
When you can do the things that I can, but you don't, and then the bad things happen, they happen because of you.
But when I saw innocents harmed and knew I had the power to do something about it, I couldn't just watch it all burn down around me.
This sentiment that killing evil people makes you evil doesn't consider that. It doesn't even present it as a possibility. In fact, if you presented that question to most people, they would reflexively say, no, it's not their fault. They're not responsible for the actions of another person, even if they did have the power to do something about it. It's a very selfish form of morality, putting your own personal goodness above the welfare of others. It's classic egoism, the theory that the self is or should be the motivation and goal of one's own actions. People might be dying, but at least you stuck to your principles. And apparently that's worth it. And this is reflected in the way that for a lot of shows, they will set up multiple villains and then redeem all of them. Even though having multiple villains means you can have different endings, it's treated like an all or nothing scenario. No consideration given to the impact in individual situations they've had. It's just all or nothing. And that's boring. We don't even need to get into the ethics of the situation. From a raw storytelling perspective, that's just objectively boring. The trolley problem isn't just a philosophical concept, it's found all over fiction, where characters have the power to reduce the suffering of others, usually by a large margin, and oftentimes will choose to do nothing on the basis that doing something will sacrifice their principles, prioritizing their view of themselves as a good person over the people they could have helped and chose not to. I very much believe the opposite, which is why Amorosa behaves this way, because there are millions of innocent people who deserve her compassion more than these 30. And for me, and by extension her, the notion of doing nothing in the name of personal moral purity at the expense of others is unacceptable. It is supremely unacceptable. And a Sith is not bound by such chains. I find the discourse surrounding any piece of media would be more interesting if more people thought about this. If this was a real thing that a story itself and the people who discuss it for a living actually considered and talked about, even if they ultimately came down on the side of egoism and that inaction is not an act of evil. That would still be more interesting because at least it presents something that you can talk about. And most of the time, the victims of these terrible people are an afterthought, if they're even considered at all. The question isn't even presented or considered and is always treated as a personal moral test for the hero when it really shouldn't be about them. Even if you agree with this perspective, the victims of these horrible people should be given at least as much, if not more consideration than the protagonist's ego. The protagonist should have to choose. So this is where things get open-ended. I want to hear what you have to say. If a character has the power to stop innocent people from dying at the expense of their own personal morality, and they choose not to, are those deaths their fault? Is doing nothing in the name of moral purity itself a moral failing?